The State Department under the Trump administration emphasized the need for deterrence against Iran, but one expert says the strategy is better described as coercion. Erica Borghard is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a senior director on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. She's writing about deterrence on the Atlantic Council website. Thanks for joining me, Erica. Let's start by talking about the difference between deterrence and coercion.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me here. So deterrence and coercion are similar concepts. They both sort of arose during the Cold War and are meant to address changing adversary behavior sort of short of war. There are a lot of things that make them similar. They rest on the perception of the adversary. For them to be successful, deterrent and coercive threats have to be clearly communicated. They have to affect the cost-benefit calculus of the adversary. They need to have credibility. So the adversary has to believe that you have the capability and the willingness to carry them out. And then they also both need to have some element of reassurance so that the target believes that if they do comply with what you're asking them to do, you won't sort of go ahead and inflict the cost on them anyway. So that's all the ways in which deterrence and coercion differ, but are similar, but they do differ in two critical respects. The first has to do with the relationship to the status quo and the ultimate objective of these strategies. So deterrence is about preserving the status quo. You're trying to prevent someone from taking some unwanted action that they have not yet taken, whereas coercion is about changing behavior that's ongoing. The second important difference has to do with the use of force. So with deterrence, if you have to use force, then by definition, it means that your deterrent threat has failed. Whereas coercion often involves both the threat and the limited application of force.
And why do you think this difference is important?
So it may seem like sort of an esoteric or obtuse academic debate, but it's important because both the success of both deterrent and coercive strategies really rest on how different audiences perceive them. And so if policymakers aren't using the appropriate terminology or language to describe what their strategy is, then there's a risk that they may not be appropriately communicated. And I think the other concern is that if we use sort of language of deterrence or sort of variants of deterrence like restoring deterrence or reestablishing deterrence, or this idea that I heard most recently that we're in a state of contested deterrence with Iran, then it sort of blinds us to thinking about why our deterrence strategy isn't really working. Because if you have to restore deterrence or if it's contested, it means that it's not quite working. And so if we want to get at a successful strategy, we need to be able to understand things for what they are, to be able to figure out what's working and what's not and why.
I thought it was interesting in your piece, you note that one issue might be that coercion is not considered a palatable strategy. Does that mean that, if policymakers don't want to use this term, that maybe they shouldn't be using this approach? What do you think are the implications there?
Yeah, so I do, that's never explicitly stated, but it seems to be sort of implied by how we talk about our strategy. And I think there's this idea that coercion just isn't something that the United States does. But if you look at the historical record and at the evidence, we do implement deterrence strategies, but we also implement coercion sometimes. And if we're not sort of willing to recognize the reality of what we're doing, then perhaps we should be asking ourselves sort of why we're doing it in the first place and maybe reassess the extent to which we rely on coercive strategies, both because perhaps, we may not find them palatable and so we shouldn't be doing them, and also because coercion has a limited track record of success and carries lots of different risks like escalation risk, blowback, and so on.
You make some recommendations in your piece. What do you think should be done here?
So I think the first thing that needs to be done is to clearly communicate our strategy. And again, not just because of some, obscure reason, but because how we communicate strategy affects its likelihood of success or failure. I think the second thing that needs to be done is sort of really reassess the extent to which we're relying on coercive approaches, both because we're not willing to call them what they are, then we should sort of think twice about doing them, and also because they've failed so often in recent history. And then the final recommendation is, I see a lot of this sort of permutations of deterrence that are kind of masquerading as deterrence, but are really policies of coercion coming out of a lot of senior military leaders. And, these, especially at the most senior level, field grade and above, these leaders are steeped in sort of education about strategic concepts throughout, their professional military education experiences. And so, this should really drive us to re-examine those curricula and make sure that we are appropriately educating senior leaders, both in the military and outside of the military, about sort of what these concepts mean and what their historical legacy is and the conditions under which they work or don't.
And for this kind of communication recommendation, does this apply to the Pentagon, to Congress, to the White House, or are you making it, is it more targeted toward military leaders specifically?
No, I certainly not more targeted to one constituency versus another. I think that, particularly when it comes to strategies that rest on affecting the perception of an adversary, as well as other audiences like the domestic public, allies and partners, it's important that all elements of the US government sort of get on the same page about how they communicate strategy and understand what the implications of terminology are.
Thank you so much, Erica.
Thank you.